I'm Heather Lockett, and this is Lasting Conversations. Joanna Kent is joining us today. Hi, Joanna.
Hello.
Joanna is president and CEO of Team Race Sensation, Inc. She is in charge of sponsorship, marketing, driver and team management, and all things race cars. So I'm really excited about this conversation. You and I think we have crossed paths before in town, but yesterday morning, we officially met at a networking event, and you had me at race cars. So a bit of the background of that for me is, as a kid, we used to watch the races all the time. Last week I mentioned that I got to have two dads. So this would be my second dad, Henry, whom I lived with for my childhood, loved racing, loved motorcycles, race cars. We would watch Wild World of Sports, all of that fun Saturday afternoon stuff. And so I grew up knowing AJ Foyt, Mario Andretti, all the guys from the 70s. And fun fact is, I didn't realize until I was a teenager that it was one person. Mario Andretti is one person, not two. I thought it was always two people in the car. So Joanna, hello, and tell me about race cars and what drew you. What is this passion that you have?
Ironically, very much like you. My daddy was a big race car fan. And I actually fell in love with the Indy 500 at 5 years old.
Cool.
My dad watched it every year, and I went to change the channel. And when I did, my dad got upset, and he said, "Daddy waits all year for this race, and we're watching it. And if you want to spend time with Daddy, you climb up on that couch and be quiet and be a good girl. If not, you go find your mom." So I just adored my father, and I wanted to spend time with them. So, like a good girl, I climbed up on the couch, and it started. And the most thrilling words I ever heard in my life was, "Gentlemen, start your engines."
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't ABC Sports. And
that flag goes.
Oh, the whole thing.
The whole thing.
And I was so taken by it. And the most beautiful sound I ever heard is when the race cars start up on the grid simultaneously. It was thunder 1,000 times, but it was phenomenally beautiful in my heart at 5 years old. And I was captivated by it. So my little brother was there, and he fell asleep, but I stayed the whole race, which in those days was 4 or 5 hours on a delay.
It's a long time, that's right.
And I was captivated. It was the most exciting thing I've ever seen. So that night, when the race was over and my dad turned off the TV, he got me and he carried me up to bed. And as he's carrying me up to bed, I'm telling him, Dad, I want to race there. I want to drive there. Dad, I want to be a race car driver. And that was the start. And I watched it every year since then. But I had no idea how I was ever going to get there, because that was 1,000 miles away in those days. I lived in South Jersey at the time, but it was still far away. And it was phenomenal. And then the next year, in the summer, race car drivers used to do personal appearances. They were much more accessible in the 60s and 70s and even part of the 80s than they are now. And one summer alone, I met AJ Foyt, Mario Andretti, Alonso Sr., and Bobby Unser, all in the same summer when they did personal appearances at supermarkets and car dealerships and whatnot. And that was pretty thrilling.
That's amazing. What did they think of this little girl being fans? Because let's face it, there weren't, this is a guy's sport and a guy's sport.
Well, I don't know about them, but I can tell you, as time went on,
yeah.
Not only did I wait for the race every year, but it was my favorite day to watch the 500. And I remember one year when I was probably a little older, 7 or 8, I said to my dad, when I grow up, I want to race cars and be a race car driver. And my father looked at me and said, nope. They barely let women on pit lane. He said, no way are you going to climb in that car. If anybody's going to be the race car driver in this family, it's going to be your brother. Well, that never happened.
Did you get to race?
I did a long time ago for about a half a season in IMSA. I did it only really out of getting a better understanding of what my drivers would go through and how to communicate better with them when they had issues and problems. Mm-hmm. I've always been involved and fascinated with the management part and the business end, mm-hmm. marketing end, and the promotion end. And that's my great love.
Well, that is a lot of fun. So how is it, so tell us a little bit about your business and how that bridge, or what for your career and your passion has been this part of the journey of what it is that you've been doing. And if you were in Jersey, what brought you to Florida? I know the Daytona 500 is in Florida, but was there something else? No,
actually, I was out of any connection with it growing up. Mm-hmm. Nothing to do with that. And except to show up on Memorial Day weekend on Sunday to watch it. Mm-hmm. And years later, when I was in my late teens, I got in a very bad car accident. I wrapped a car around a tree literally on Memorial weekend in the pouring rain.
Wow.
And I split my head open like a melon.
Wow.
And I herniated all the discs in my neck and all the discs in my lower back. I'm lucky I'm alive.
You're happy to be here. Wow.
But that was the turning point to a certain extent, because over the 2 years, I developed such a phobia for anything to do with a car, mm-hmm. especially in the rain. And I can remember one particular instance, I was out with my mom, and it started to pour rain. And I got so frightened, I made her pull over. I didn't even want to be a passenger in a car that somebody else was driving in the pouring rain. Mm-hmm. So after 2 years of going through the accident and healing, I had my final checkup with the neurologist. And he told me that as far as he was concerned, the issues that I had with my brain injury were pretty well healed and would never really affect my day-to-day life. And he gave me a really clean bill of health, and that was it. So when I got home that night over dinner, my father asked me what the doctor said and told him. And he said, great, now you can get on with your life. Well, my head was healed, mm-hmm. but my phobia was still huge and my anxiety. Mm-hmm. So we just discussed dealing with it. And I didn't want anything to do with a car. So my father said, hey, kid, if that's the case, you got to move to New York City because we don't have any public transportation here. He said, there's no subways, and you got to get on with your life. You got to go to college. You got to get a job. You got to get on with your life. Okay. So we let it go for a while. And a couple of weeks later, my brother had gotten an invitation to go see a big professional auto race in Miami. And he was telling my dad about it. And this commercial comes on television about the series champion driver walking the track. And he says to my dad, that's it. That's the race. That's the place. We saw the commercial. When it ended, my dad said, I know that guy in the commercial. You do? He said, yeah. He says, when you were little, I used to tell you stories about how Daddy would help his friend out on weekends in Pennsylvania crewing for this man and his son. I said, yeah, we remember. He said, well, that's the son all grown up.
Wow.
And unbeknownst to me, within a few days, my father found him after 20 years and called him up and told him what was going on. So when he invited my dad and me to the track, my dad told me, he said, you want to go see the race on Sunday? I said, sure, absolutely. It was my first pro race. I had never been anything close to a race car at that point. Well, the man was beyond awesome, and we thought we were just going to get general admission tickets and wave hello over the pit wall. But he arranged for the card hardcore credentials, which is teamed credentials.
That's a big deal.
It is a big deal.
That's a very big deal.
And what was marvelous about it is I got to be his shadow for the day.
Oh my goodness.
And he took me everywhere. I went to press conferences. I went to prayer meetings. I went to driver conference where they talk about the conditions of the racetrack and the rules and what to look out for. I actually went to a meeting with him with a private Porsche engineer. He knew I knew nothing about things in those days, so it didn't matter. But I look back on it and I said, my God, I had stood there for an hour and listened to him talk to top Porsche engineers on how to set up the car and drive the car. And I just got to see it from the pits. I never saw it from the grandstands that day. And it left such a positive impression. And it was literally a life-changing moment for me. So when it was all over, we went to dinner with the team and everything. And he said, so what do you think, kid? You think you're going to go back to driving a car? I said, oh my God, how do I get into this world? Mm-hmm. He said, you call me on Thursday when I get back to town and I will tell you.
Oh my goodness.
And that started it. And that was the beginning of me being exposed to pro racing, being involved in pro racing. When he would race 5 times a year in Florida, I would work for the team. I didn't get paid, but I didn't care. I was the gopher, but I didn't care. I was in my element. I was learning everything. Nothing was off limits to me. Then he told me about a wonderful organization called SCCA, Sports Club Car of America. That's club racing. He said, do this between pro racing and you'll learn even more. And I got involved with that and learned about race cars and all from the ground up, which was phenomenal. And in those days, SCCA did the rescue work. Now the big sanctions, NASCAR, IndyCar, Formula One, and IMSA, they had their own safety teams. Mm-hmm. But I'm going back 34, 35 years. Right. They didn't have that. And they trained people within this organization how to do first response work. So lo and behold, my adrenaline got the best of me, and I decided I wanted to do that. And I had my place. If you could imagine this, I'm a small person. I'm 5'4". And these race cars have a cockpit very much like a jet fighter, and they're very compact and small. So who's doing the rescue work? But mostly big guys, because you need the physical strength to lift up the car parts when the car crashes and the wheels and stuff like that. Well, the problem with that is those guys can't get inside the cockpit. And the driver's inside.
They need help.
And he's strapped in a 5-point harness, tight as could be. A lot of times when you have a crash of any significance, drivers fall into shock, and you can't feel it. It happened to me once in another accident, and you can't feel it, but you're just not there. So when you would have a substantial accident, we rehearsed it through and through for weekends on end, but we had a routine, and they would come, and somebody bigger than me would lift the door. And they're like gull wing doors. And then they would turn me on my side and they would put me inside the car. Oh, wow. And then I would knock on the driver's helmet and lift his visor. And I was taught what to look for in his eyes. Sure. And if his eyes were out of focus and spacey and all that, I would ask him questions. Then I would knock 3 times on the ceiling of the car. That alerted them that the driver's in shock. I would undo the harnesses. Then they would pull me out. And then they could send somebody in much bigger to start retrieving the driver. But it's almost impossible if the driver is locked down into these tight harnesses. Sure. So my job was to undo the harnesses. And I had the greatest time. So about a year later, I was doing rescue work for SCCA at that race. And I was pulling drivers out of wrecks as the cars went past me at 160 miles an hour, and I had no fear. And I had gone back to driving the car, and I even went to a couple race schools at that point. So that ignited this big passion. And because I was always around pro racing and loved it very much, I started to have different people say to me, this could be yours someday if you really want it, work toward it. And I've been on the journey ever since.
This is so fascinating, and all these learning points along the way, and that there's a space for you, quite literally, because you were a small person, that they needed you in there to help these guys out. So now tell me more about what's happening now, of what it is that you're doing within the industry. And the other thing I know that I'm going to want to tap into is, we know that the industry, as all industries, morph and change, and that there are more women, there are more girls. And we're going to talk about sponsorships and things like that. And are there sponsorship levels to be facilitating and growing what the girls are now able? Like, you came in the beginning and you had some beautiful mentors. And do you find that is happening now? And is that a wheelhouse? So I know I think I laid out about 4 different questions, but so tell us about now what it is that you're doing.
Sponsorship on a pro race car is a billboard that goes 200 miles an hour.
Right.
So anything that you would see on a billboard, you could basically put on a race car. Unlike the billboards on 95 or on the radio or anything like that, people don't leave. So if you're going down 95 and you see a great electronic billboard, you glance at it, but you keep going. When you put sponsorship on a race car, the people that see it and focus on it are people sitting in the stands, and they're not there for a second and a half.
Hours.
They're there for hours, if not the whole day on end.
Right.
Then it tides over from the race car to the transport to the driver uniform, the crew uniform. In the IndyCar series, the transport alone, the trucks from race to race to race, goes 38,000 miles a year. So if your name's on the side of that truck, over 38,000 miles, people are seeing you. When the name is on the car is going around for several hundred laps. So over a period of 2 hours or 3 hours, people are focused on that car, either consciously because that's their team and their driver, or subconsciously because they're there. When you race at the Indy 500, I'm pretty certain, because they keep adding to it, but last count, there was 14 Jumbotron screens throughout the race course. So in years before the Jumbotrons, the cars would go out of sight and you wouldn't see them for another half lap. Well, now they don't go out of sight because they're on the Jumbotron. So no matter where you are on the racetrack, your team, your driver, you see him the whole time. So it's like almost 4 hours if there's a good race with no accidents. It's very, very powerful. It could be your favorite commercial, your favorite television show, your favorite movie. You're not going to sit there for 4 hours and watch it repeatedly. Every time a race car goes around a lap, it's equivalent to a 30-second or a minute commercial. Nobody's going to sit there for 200 commercials watching the same thing over and over again. But you do it subconsciously when you are a fan in the stands. At a racetrack. But then it goes off into other things now. We go into television, we go into radio broadcasts, we go into podcasts, we go into social media. It's huge market saturation. And it's a very, very powerful tool for promotion and marketing and establishing brand loyalty.
And so do you have certain drivers or teams of drivers that you enjoy sponsoring in particular, having the sponsors show up for?
I have different teams that I've worked with in the past, and I actually represent some drivers and I work with other drivers, and it a lot depends on what the sponsor would like. And ironically, for the best part, I have worked with a lot of big people in racing. I brought money to Andretti. I brought money to Ray Hall and Letterman. I brought money to Foyt and different people. So the people that I watched race when I was a little girl, I grew up to work with in my adult age. So
that is really, really beautiful and such a full moment. I can't imagine how expensive it must be to have a car, all the equipment, your pit crew, everything that goes into it. I think these days we're so used to kind of this whole superstardom factor, but there are a lot of other people before you reach TV even, that it must just take thousands and thousands of dollars and a lot of sweat equity, and there's a science to it.
Corporate America recognizes the value, and corporate America stands behind it and sponsors it. The days of a private individual that's wealthy financing something on this level doesn't exist anymore. But it doesn't have to.
Right.
Because corporate America, within the Fortune 100 companies, even worldwide, they realize the power in it and the loyalty and the level of intensity that they're more than happy to come on board with the right program and be part of it.
Mm-hmm. So I just had 2 or 3 thoughts at the same time, per usual, for those who know me. I'm thinking ahead for the future and who is still interested in racing. So the kids now that are like you, and you were a kid saying, I'm going to do this someday. And other kids that might not have access or have families that throw on the TV and watch a race. Do you have, summer programs or summer camps, or are there people that bring up and foster other kids just to show them around and say, this is a driving experience? And the segue to that is, I was just thinking, our local racetrack here has closed.
Yeah, I know. That was my home track.
Right.
I spent a lifetime on that racetrack. So
exactly.
I was very sad when all that happened.
So are there other pieces of property like that are morphing into other developments?
It may. There's been some loose talk for a year now, at least a year, that they are trying to raise the funds to build another facility. And that actually may be a great thing, because that racetrack out there is over 60 years old. And it was a nice track, but it didn't keep pace with the industry either. Where if they build something new in the future, there's talk west of that racetrack or even in Martin County, that it's going to be a state-of-the-art track. And they're pulling very heavily, which is a very strong possibility if they could build it. They'll build it to specifications that big pro races can be run there. That could never happen at that other small track because of the size and just not meeting the safety requirements and everything for pro racing. For club racing, of course, it always met the requirements for safety because that's what the purpose was. But there's talk that if they go and establish and start to build a new racetrack, it's to get big pro races in there. It could be NASCAR, it could be IndyCar, it could be IMSA, whatever comes across their path that they could can do. So maybe in a good way, it's okay too. What's surprising, and I always knew it existed, but to actually see it, that when there was word going around that racetrack was sold and was going to close, a phenomenal amount of people came out and voiced their objection and threw their support behind it. And that was phenomenal to see from my point, to know that there's a lot of wonderful people that love racing in Florida. So it's whatever they build in the future is going to be phenomenal. So,
well, I look forward to that. And what was also fun out there is that they had all kinds of things. There was demolition derby, and there was, mudding and Oh, and the monster trucks, and they had all kinds of wild things. So if people didn't necessarily care, and I think even motorcycles, if they didn't care for pro racing or the racing, but there was something for everybody.
Oh,
and for a good old time, you pull up.
There was drag racing, and there was the club racing. I'll tell you what, not too many people realize about that racetrack is because it was very far away, meaning it wasn't close to anything in its day.
In its day, because now it feels like it's just down the road because there's been so much development. Yeah.
But then within 15 miles east, there was nice hotels and stuff. And they had very inexpensive rates for what it was.
Right.
And some of the biggest race teams and drivers in the world have driven and tested on that track. Michael Schumacher was there at one point in his career. Senna was there. NASCAR drivers were there. IndyCar drivers were there. They were there testing because it was very private. It was reasonable. It's very expensive to race at a racetrack for a couple of days. And nice hotels around it, 20 minutes from an airport, easy accessible by transport with a truck, with the turnpike in 95. So it's surprising that the history of the drivers that actually were there.
Are you a bit of a historian? Do you have some old photos and plaques? And do
I
you
have stories.
Lots of stories.
I have phenomenal stories, and a very big collection of books that go back long time in regard to different teams in racing and series in racing and events in racing. So yeah, that was a big part of it.
Nice. And was your dad, was he in the race world or the car world at all, or he had a whole different profession?
No, my father did various things, but what my father was at one point in his life, he was a transport master, I believe they call it master sergeant in the Marine Corps. He was taught how to fix a car in the Marine Corps. But he always had a fascination with race cars and cars since he was a little boy. So this was a big passion with him that I just grew to love. At one point in my father's life, he started to restore some old Porsches and a couple of T-Birds, and I just loved being around all that. And then when I got involved with racing after meeting this gentleman, it was when people say they find their purpose and they find their meaning, that was it. And it was instantaneously. And I love it with all my heart.
Oh, that's so amazing. And are you mechanical as well? Can you fix a tire? And well, you would have anyway with your profession, but even before that, were you a good tinkerer?
Yeah. Just because it was a big thing in my father's life and I had an interest in it. But being in the management side of the sport and wanting to be an owner or what they call a principal with other people, I really had to become proficient at understanding what was going on. And in fact, one of my most biggest accomplishments in that was I was invited down to private test sessions with Andretti and I'm trying to think who else was there, Patrick, down in Homestead. And they had come out of Indianapolis to set these cars up. And that's a wonderful thing in itself because you're not fighting 250,000 people to see it. It's just you and 20, 30 people at max. So you spend really quality time around all this. And in those days, Newman Haas ran what they call Cosworth. And Cosworth is a Ford motor, but it's engineered and I believe assembled in those days out of England. So when I was down there for the day, I got to meet the Cosworth engineers and talk to them. And we all went out to dinner when it was all over. And I spent 2 hours talking shop with the best racing engineers in the world at the time. And I understood a lot of what they were saying. And they were just fascinated that I did understand that it wasn't like all Greek to me. It was something that I can intelligently communicate for. And they asked me if I was involved in engineering and all. And I said, no. I said, I just want to be a really good team owner. And it's important to me that I understand what you're talking about, your issues, and to communicate with you. And they were just floored. And I still talk to them once in a while, and I've known them over 20 years. So, yeah, the most wonderful thing about auto racing, and it doesn't matter if it's NASCAR or Formula One, IndyCar, it's very much something a lady could get involved in and do phenomenally well. I can't play pro football. I'm a small young woman. How am I going to go up against a 300-pound quarterback or fullback? Can't play baseball. Certainly can't play pro basketball. I'm 5'4". But you know what? A lady that's my size can climb into any race car, including a dry car, and do phenomenally well because the car does all of the work. All the woman does, or the driver, is the brains, meaning the acceleration and the turning and stuff like that. But physically, there's no difference between a man driving a race car and a woman. And a long time ago, I read an article that talked about how women actually are able to excel in certain pro sports that men can't. Tennis, golf, and auto racing. And they said, according to this psychologist, that this goes back hundreds of years. And the reason why they thought women could do better at certain sports is because a woman used to do all the sewing at one point. Mm-hmm. And a woman learned to work in very, very small increments. So a woman sees the tenths of an inch where a man sees a foot. Mm-hmm. And they thought that was such an advantage in auto racing that a woman could just get into smaller, tighter spaces and do so much better than a man. And yeah, I believe that very much so. And I'm involved in the business end. So this is just leadership and business decisions and knowing my industry. So there's a lot of good things that can come by having more women involved. And we're making progress. And someday, I believe you'll see a field that's 1/3 or half full. The Indy 500 are women. There's so many great lady drivers out there all over the world. And they're starting to come now to the top and the surface. And I happen to be part of that.
Well, that's a lot of fun. How do you see the future? How do you see the technology of these cars? We have electric cars now, or the likes of the Teslas getting into racing, or they're keeping that to rocket ships and things like that. But how do you see, before you're going to have retirement age, which might be a very long time because anybody in their passion never really wants to retire. But so how do you see the next generation?
I see it continuing on the path it is. I'm going to see more alternative energy cars involved in pro racing. So many of the top manufacturers in the world have now developed electric cars that are race ready. Predominantly in Europe right now. It hasn't really come to America, but it will at some point. Years ago, I was able to see the Formula E race in Miami when it came to America. It was one of the most exciting races I've ever seen in my life, and I've been on some of the biggest racetracks in the United States. And it was like NASCAR meets Formula One. It was crazy, crazy, exciting and dramatic and just awesome and quick. And it was electric cars. And when you take away a motor and the sound of the motor, it's interesting what you hear. You could hear the braking, you could hear the acceleration, you could hear the car sliding, all sorts of sounds that the regular motors mask. And to see it through an electric standpoint, it was an experience. And the cars were very, very quick and swift, and the drivers that drove them were very aggressive. So I could see that making its way full stream at some point in the next decade at least. And then there's other alternatives. Hydrogen, when that comes on the scene, that's going to be a pretty big thing too. And you're going to have that same kind of level of excitement and endurance and stamina. And it's just going to be phenomenal. So I'm very excited.
It sounds like so much fun. So, and how can we help you now? What do you have the continued purpose to your passion? And is there something in particular that you are looking for? Is there somebody that needs some sponsoring in particular to help
always
grow
looking
their
for
wings?
Sponsors. Always looking for sponsors. So, and you can't have enough sponsors, by the way.
None of us, we could all use a few sponsors.
You can never have enough. And so what I'm known for in my industry, by Andretti Racing, they call me a marketing guru because I have the ability to go in and take a company or product or service and brainstorm to bring that to something that relates either to pro racing or the car themselves or the driver. And that's one of my favorite aspects of my career, that I can do that stuff. And I do custom programs. So if someone was to come to me and say, we would like to compete in certain markets, but not the whole full race, or we're looking for certain personality traits or accomplishments in a driver, or we want a certain type of car, a certain type of brand, I put it all together. I've been in this business in and out going on 35 years now. So I've learned a lot, and I have a lot of great connections and a lot of wonderful people that I work with. And then I have this aspect where I'm very creative. So I had the ability to put it all together and implement it. And I learned a long time ago. I have the ability, which I thought was common. I thought everybody in my industry and the business end can do this. But I can go out to dinner with somebody and get talking about racing and flip over a paper placemat and start taking notes about what they want and where they want to go, what they want to do and accomplish. And 6 months later, I can have that team up and running on the grid just that fast. So, yeah. But that's because I love it so much. People have said to me through the years, my God, how do you get through these long weekends? And how do you get through this? And how do you get through that? And not only do you get through it, but if you really love it, you enjoy it. To me, I never work in racing. Never. You know that old saying, if you find the job or the profession you love, you don't work a day in your life. And it's true. I enjoy all kinds of aspects of it. And, God, one of the biggest thrills was I was at Indianapolis last year for private testing for rookies, where rookies came from all over the world to try out. I'm in the biggest speedway in the world. The track is 2 miles long. I'm there with probably 130 people. The speedway can hold 1 million people. I was there with 130.
Wow.
And I can tell you right where I was. I was in the garages right before the tower, and it was a phenomenal experience, and it was really wonderful to see the speedway with nobody in it, and it felt very different, and it was just phenomenal. And I did a little driving coaching that weekend, and I watched a couple of my rookies that I was thinking about signing, and ended up signing everybody at the end of the weekend, and it was just phenomenal. And it was an incredible group of people, not just the crews that manned these teams, but the young people that competed in it. There was 40 drivers. And you got to go to a driver's meeting every morning. It talks about track conditions, rules, regulations, what happens in an emergency, just a lot of stuff to discuss. And it's mandatory. And I remember sitting in the meeting, and when everybody was coming in, these young people, they were talking and laughing, and everybody knew everybody, which was interesting. And then the meeting started. And these kids went from being 17, 18, 19 years old to being as serious as could be. You were thinking they were in a boardroom somewhere. Not a sound in the house. Everybody paid attention. And then the questions that came up were phenomenal. We're dealing with people 17, 18 years old. They had so much going for them, just like the pro racers that are in their late 20s and their 30s. It was really impressive. And that's the future of the sport. And it was just a phenomenal thing to be part of. And I love what happens on a race day on a Sunday, but I love what happens in the off days more than anything. The testing, the qualifying, the hiring of drivers, the assembling of teams, the meetings with potential sponsors. And it's been a gift. And I've always thought that from the first time I went to a racetrack. I always knew it was a gift that God gave me. And it started from my childhood. Can I tell you a good AJ story?
I would love to hear a good AJ story.
A few years ago.
This would be AJ Foyt.
AJ Foyt.
For those of you that can't know exactly which AJ.
AJ Foyt is a 4-time Indy 500 winner.
Yep.
Him and Mario, they called them the godfathers of open wheel racing, formula racing.
And so this would have been back in the 70s that this story is?
No, I actually, this, what I experienced was probably about 3 years ago.
Oh, okay, cool.
So, but I had watched AJ Foyt race my whole career. Mm-hmm. And I worked for them a little bit here and there as an independent contractor, but I didn't have much interaction with AJ. It was more of the son and team managers and different things. So I am looking for a drive for an IndyCar driver that I knew of that wanted to get back into the sport, and agreed to represent him. So I went out to Sebring to meet up with some teams that I contacted. And that was phenomenal. And I went out and spent the time with them. And I watched the rookies and I watched their crews work. And it was great. So it was what they call private test. So that means not everybody's there, not the whole series. Whoever's there, this was Honda, I believe, at the time. So there were 4 teams that were racing Honda. And Honda paid for it, which is a big part of it. Mm-hmm. So we're off way in the back, away from all kinds of prying eyes. Not that there were anybody there, but when they do classified testing, they keep it under wraps as possible.
Sure.
So I was told where to go, and I go there. And it wasn't the traditional pit. It was a corner that they had put the transports in. There were 4 of them, and they were right next to each other. Usually they're spread out, but this particular time they were right next to each other. And the team that I was meeting with was the 4th one in line. So I had to walk through the other teams to get to where I was going. And I saw AJ sitting on a golf cart. And every time I walked past, he would smile, wave. And I walked past several times to get to different places and whatnot. And I had lunch with the team. That was pretty cool and everything. And then I left. And on the way out, I said to myself, go introduce yourself and thank him. Thank him for being the most wonderful driver that you enjoyed your whole life watching since a little girl. He's old. He's 80 years old. Anything could happen to this guy. Go say thank you. So he was sitting in the golf cart. He was talking to different people, and his secretary was close by. And then finally, everybody kind of left, and I was standing there. And I did. I introduced myself, and I thanked him. And he asked me, what brings you here today? And I told him. And he invited me to sit with him in the golf cart. So for 2.5 hours, I had this racing legend basically to myself. Now, why was he sitting in the golf cart and not on a pit lane? Because he suffered with horrible sciatica. Horrible sciatica. Couldn't move. Could barely move. So basically, he climbed in that golf cart in the morning and he stayed there all day. Well, I pretty much a back expert because when you wrap a car around a tree and things happen.
You might learn a few things.
I suffered with it most of my life, my adult life. Well, I know what I had to do to overcome it, and it was very effective. So we got talking about it, and I told him, and he was willing to give it a try because he was in so much pain. So his secretary called the doctor and asked for a certain medicine, and then they called for someone else for therapy and all, and it was great. And when it was all over and it was time for the testing to be over, I told him, I said, AJ, this was one of the best birthdays I ever had in my life. He said, oh, it's your birthday? I said, yeah. He says, my birthday was 2 weeks ago. I said, yep, January 16th. And he gave me a great big hug and kiss. And he said, you're right. This was a really good birthday. I hope you're happy. And he said, I hope whatever comes of all of this with you, you do well. He said, and I'm always available to you. And it was just awesome. Just me and him. No real interruptions. Nobody pulling at him. No other fans. It was just me and him on a golf cart on a racetrack in the middle of Florida. And that was that. And then a month later, I met him up at St. Petersburg for the opening race. And I wanted to stop by and say hello. And he kissed me and hugged me very tightly. And he said, you saved me. Saved you? He said, yeah. He said, I took the medicines. I went in for the therapy like you told me. He said, the sciatica is gone. He said, I haven't had relief from that in months. I said, well, believe it or not, God puts people in right there in front of you when you need it. And he says, you're so right. And he said, I owe you so much. I said, nope, you owe me nothing. I said, you gave me years and years of pleasure watching you race and win and just get to spend time with you. I said, that was one of the best birthdays I ever had. I said, so I appreciate it with all my heart. And that was the beginning of a really good friendship and a tight relationship with that particular team. And hopefully when I go to Indy, I may very well run with them. So that would be phenomenal.
Is such a magical moment, a magical, again, full circle for you, your childhood, one of your heroes, and then to bring it forward. And in that very, I was going to say just stupendous. I'm thinking of a synchronistic moment, but it was a stupendous, almost transcendent moment. And that's magic, that shared wisdom on a park bench called a golf cart, just two of you. Oh my gosh.
It really was. After it was all over and I was driving home, it was surreal to think that somebody I had watched and admired and just thought the world of from the time I was a little girl, I got to spend time with, and invitation to work more in the future and just everything. And the sad part was he was one of my dad's most favorite drivers. And my dad had passed away by that time, maybe 6-7 years. And I couldn't go home and tell my dad who I spent the last few hours with. But somehow I think my dad knew. But he would have been thrilled to think that I spent time with him. And I met a lot of wonderful, wonderful people in my sport very unexpectedly.
Nice. So we're going to have to chat some more because
we will.
This is
I have lots of stories.
Oh my gosh, the stories just keep.
I didn't even get to Paul Newman and Tom Cruise yet.
Oh my God. Okay, so seriously, pen pencil this in. I'm looking at the crew here in the studio.
So if you'll have me back, I would more than love to come and tell you those stories about that part.
Around here, we call that the ... So, but wait, there's more. Joanna Kent, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it so much.
We'll have you back. And thank you all for listening. Please be sure to like, follow, review, and share this podcast. And if you'd like to be part of the conversation, send emails to podcasts@lastingconversations.com and follow us on Facebook. This is Lasting Conversations. We get to the heart of everything.